You still have a British passport?
Yeah.
I became a Canadian citizen in 1955. I went to England this year, and my passport was stamped. So I said, and it was on the top, not allowed to work here. I said, excuse me.
How bizarre.
Excuse me, are you kidding? I was born here. And up to now, anybody whose grandfather was born here, you could work in England. She said, not now. This is the common market. This is the ECU. He said, you're a foreigner. You're a Canadian.
Oh.
Can you believe that? That's the first time that's happened this year.
Rats. Oh, well, the British Civil Service, it sounds like they never were too nice to you. We're ready. We're rolling already, so I have a quote about from actress Barbara Byrne.
Oh, yes, yes.
About, two teenage girls.
Yes. This refers to the, when we did that tour of the mainland, although we were losing a lot of money, it had its, I must say, it had its funnier moments, because I can remember we were playing, I think it was in St. John, New Brunswick, in the school auditorium there, and some of these auditoriums were awful. They were, one half of the stage was the stage, and the other half was a basketball court, and there were sliding doors across the back of it, and the poor old audience is sitting way out here. And we were trying to play Score for Scandal one evening when there was a basketball game going on the other side of the shutters. And you could hear the referee's whistle blowing on Mr. Sheridan's best lines, and people thumping about and screaming. And we did a special matinee for the schools, I remember, of Score for Scandal. And Barbara Bryn, who is doing very, very well at Stratford right now, who was our assistant stage manager, she's a good actress too, and she's become really quite a notable actress. She played all the leads at Minneapolis for a long time, and then now she's gone to Stratford, where she's really one of the big names there. And Barbara was sitting in a little cafe outside the school, where all these kids were talking, and they'd all been to see this special production of Score for Scandal. And she heard one of them say, well, what did you think of it? And the other girl said, I didn't understand a word of it. The whole thing was in English. And I know what she means with the very clipped English. And the other one, you know, the thing with a play like Score for Scandal is to keep it going. And what we used to do is you'd have a pair of curtains, and when a scene finishes, the curtains draw, somebody pushes a sofa out there, and that's a corridor in Sir Peter Teasel's house, you know, just to keep it going. You didn't want to keep changing big sets, and then we'd throw a shawl over it, and that was a corridor in Sir Joseph Surface's house. And so another girl said, and that same old sofa kept coming on and going off. And there was another, on the tour, I'm reminded of another incident. We were doing Camille, and I think we were playing in Kingston. And Bernard Thompson, the stage manager, while they were putting up the set, one of the scenery flats swiveled around and cut a little gash in his head. So they rushed him off to the hospital. He was also playing in the play. Everybody played, the stage management. And so they got to the hospital, to the emergency, and they said, oh, I think we better put some stitches in there. They got some scissors, and they were going to cut a chunk out of his hair. He said, don't do that, don't do that. I've got to go on as a Comte de Gire in 45 minutes. Oh, my God. And he left, and he tore out of the hospital, got into costume, and he went on. And another thing about the tour is we played in Ottawa, and the CRT, Canadian Repertory Theatre, was resident there. It was one of the earliest companies in Canada. I'm not sure if it was fully professional at that time, but there were certainly a tremendous number of professionals in the company, and we absolutely destroyed them that week because all their audience defected to see us. And we felt terribly, terribly badly about it. And Amelia Hall, who ran that company, invited our whole company to come to their theatre on the Saturday night to welcome us after the show, had a party on the stage for us. We'd taken all their business and they entertained us, which was absolutely marvellous. So on the Monday, we invited them all to come and see Camille. We had one more performance to do, Camille.
Could you tell me just very briefly what were the audiences generally like on your tour? How did you find them?
One felt, I think to begin with, the audiences on tour, to begin with, they weren't used to going to the theatre. I mean, that was fairly obvious. I think they were easily shocked. We had one scene which was quite harmless, but it was called Spring Model. We were touring a new farce called Spring Model, in which one of the girls, one of the members of the cast is an artist, and there's a girl sitting with his back to her, and apparently nude to the waist, which she wasn't, but she looked like it from the front. This really shocked one or two people. I found they were rather easily shocked. In other words, they weren't theatre trained. I think that would rapidly change, except when we got to the Grand Theatre London. This was a trained theatre audience, and that was quite different. I don't think we gave them a terribly good choice of plays, to tell you the truth. School for Scandal was fine, but as I was playing in the School for Scandal and playing in Oliver Surface, which is quite a large part, it's very difficult for me to play and to be 100 miles ahead of the company running a box office somewhere, which I had to keep ahead of them. And there was a time when we were playing in Ottawa, and I had the box office open in Peterborough, which is quite a long drive in those days when the roads were very narrow, and I was commuting to Peterborough. I was leaving Ottawa at 5:30 in the morning, driving to Peterborough, getting some publicity going there, driving back to Ottawa to go on at night to play Oliver Surface. And I tell you, there was one morning, I went to sleep at the wheel, and I went off the road, fortunately up a hill, which put me back on the road, woke me up. I've never done that since, and that was 50 years ago. 50 years ago.
I'll blast through some more stuff on tour. Some of the hitches. The Ken Stoney in his performance in the Deep Blue Sea.
Yes. Another incident that happened on tour. This was the very first date on tour, as a matter of fact. We played Sydney and Nova Scotia. And I doubt if they'd ever seen a professional theatre company before, which happened in a lot of the places we toured. And they'd all arrived on the Newfie Bullet, the company. The train, the little narrow gauge railway that went across Newfoundland. That was quite a story too. We ran a social club for the train crew on that trip, I remember. They all carried our bags onto the ferry, and they were wobbling a bit, including the engine driver, by the time we got to the ferry. But we played Sydney that night, and we were playing a play called The Deep Blue Sea.
Please hold. Problem?
I got my hand in front of the microphone.
Oh, okay.
We were playing Sydney that night, and we were playing The Deep Blue Sea, and Kevin Stoney was playing the German doctor in it, and it was essentially, he wore a black Homburg hat because he comes in from the street with a coat on, and he left his hat on the Newfie Bullet. So my partner Oliver was backstage, and Kevin said, "Where's my hat?" And he realized he'd left it on the train. So Oliver dashed out into the front, into the cloakroom, grabbed the first black Homburg he could see, dashed backstage, clapped it on Kevin's head, and on he goes. And when right at the end of the play, because Kevin's in the last scene, Oliver had to wait till he comes off stage, take his hat, and go back and hang it up again on hook 63. So that the owner never knew he'd been washing his own hat the whole evening.
Oliver Gordon. Okay, you told that story. Hook 63. Yeah. 14,000, right. Okay, I've covered that. Radio show, yeah. Whilst in Newfoundland, you were involved in some of the school's broadcast program? And
well, it was a marvelous asset for the actors, because suddenly finding yourself, or producers suddenly finding a bunch of professional actors in the town, The CBC in St. John's, which originated quite a bit of radio, I mean, this was a godsend to them. So the company was being constantly used for school broadcasts, little dramas. There was, in one year, we even recorded Twelfth Night in 5 half-hour episodes or 6 half-hour episodes, which would be played after we left there. And this was all, wasn't highly paid, but it was all extra money for the actors. We even had our own, on the sponsored radio, we started our own radio show, which was a terrible steal from the BBC. It was a show called Keep Talking, where you had two teams, the men and the women, and you had to start talking about a certain subject for 1 minute without being interrupted or repeating yourself. And we used to do that on the stage on Monday nights. After the performance, the audience could stay behind to make an audience, because you wanted the audience reactions, and that was sponsored. And the actors used to take it in turns, so they'd do a show every 2 weeks. And they would make the same as their salary for that 1.5 hour. So this was an enormous incentive to us to bring actors the following years to say, well, you're going to make this on the radio as well. And that was a tremendous incentive for us to get other people.
Canada Council, right.
Yes. The last year, which was touch and go, and you had this tremendous community effort, I was approached by a man called Robert Furlong, who is now the Lord Chief Justice, incidentally, and he said, listen, there is a new department, government department, just been formed called the Canada Council. And the whole purpose of the Canada Council is to help companies like you. And I can get you a grant to keep going. And I said, but I don't want a grant. I want people sitting in the seats. And I don't want anybody to tell me what shows I should do, because we're strictly a commercial enterprise. So he said, but you're fighting television. I said, I know, and that's going to take 2 years, and I'm not prepared to fight them for 2 years, because I'm not prepared to give back to the community everything the community has given us, which has been taking a long time to save. And so I refused it, and that would have been certainly the first Canada Council grant in the Maritimes, and possibly one of the first Canada Council grants ever given, because this was in 1957, the year the Canada Council was formed. And I tell you, my opinion of course, if I were asked today, my answer might have been different. It might not, because I have opinions about subsidizing the theatre. We're all going to have to get used to the fact that the theatre is not going to be subsidized to the extent it was, and eventually it isn't going to be subsidized at all. So I think we're all going to have to start getting used to that fact. Will the theatre die? Of course it won't. There'll always be people like me who will say, I've got to do a play, I'm going to raise the money from somebody commercially, and I'm going to put on a play. And there is a trend now, certainly in Toronto, where you've got 4 theatres, 5 theatres, operating entirely commercially, not with any subsidies at all. I think it's essential for the ballet to be subsidized, because you have to run the ballet school. It's essential for opera. Opera singers can't sing 52 weeks a year. Their voices wouldn't stand it. It's essential. I think the time has come when companies like Stratford and Shaw, who've had this help in the beginning for many years to build them up, have now got to the point where they should be self-supporting. They're doing enormous business at the box office. They're charging almost Broadway prices. The whole point of subsidies in the beginning was to reduce price of theatre seats so the man in the street could afford to go to the theatre. The money isn't being spent that way now. It's more money to spend on the sets and on the costumes, all of which are frankly upstaging the actors. To my mind, costumiers and designers and lighting people should help the actor, not compete with him. The sets are now becoming so expensive and so elaborate that you spend, the first few minutes looking at the set and saying, look at that beautiful vase over there. And you don't look at the actors. If you don't look at the actors, you don't know what they're saying. If you're not looking at a person's lips, funnily enough, if a stage isn't lit properly and you're looking at the person and you can't see his lips, you don't really hear what they're saying. And it's essential. If people ask me to direct, which they haven't asked me for about a year, and I really now don't really want to do it anymore because I don't think I've got the physical abilities because they're terribly, terribly tiring. But I would love somebody. In fact, I've said to people when they've asked me to direct a play, a classic, could I do it in black drapes, get the finest lighting man you know, so that the people are going to look at the actors and not at the set. I've never succeeded in persuading anybody yet, but that's what I'd like to do. So we go back to the days when you look and you listen to the actors and you get involved.
Who did your, in the London Theatre Company, you were saying everybody did everything just about. Could you wipe your mouth, please? Thanks. Everybody did everything, sort of, right? So who did the sets? This is what you get, right?
No, we had the only person other than an actor that we traveled from England was a scenic designer who also painted his own sets. He never had an assistant. He could do, if we could do a play in a week, rehearse it and learn it, he would sometimes have to do 2 sets and even 3. Sometimes there's the 3-set play. He still only had a week. Mind you, he knew what was coming ahead and he might start on one of those things earlier on. We had the same scenic designer for 5 of the 6 years. It was a tremendous loss to us when he left us because he was so brilliant. He was, I'd say, our success was as much due to him as to any of the actors. He never failed to get a review, and in the leading article, which we always got after we'd left the town, summing up the season, he never missed being mentioned once. And they would mention the company. They very rarely mentioned an actor. Occasionally had mentioned Hilary Vernon, who was their favorite, but he never missed making, because he was so good. He transformed that tiny stage. You really believed that you were in a castle somewhere, or in the pantomimes, in Aladdin's cave. I can remember when the treasure all rolled out. George had been round collecting bottle tops, and these were all sprayed gold. And he had an enormous box full of these. So when they finally struck a hole and found the cave, the treasure in the cave, somebody off stage was pouring all these bottle caps that were going all over the stage like gold nuggets. Things like, he was marvelous. He was a marvelous designer.
The DDF influenced Canadian theatre, of course.
Yes. The Domain Drama Festival, I adjudicated a couple of them, which is a fairly tough experience if they don't like what you say. I used to make a habit of going around after adjudicating a particular drama festival. I didn't do the finals, but I used to do the regional finals. And I would always go make a point after seeing the evening performance, giving my notes on the stage, and then going round to the home of one member of the cast and tell them privately what I thought, when I would be a little more severe. Well, occasionally you'd get somewhere where they didn't want to hear anything at all. All they wanted to hear was praise, and if you had anything else to say, they didn't want. So I used to say, why did you ask me to come? Why did you ask me to come if you don't want to listen? But that only happened occasionally. Now, we were, of course, never got involved in, because the drama festival, although they produced a lot of the professionals to be in this country. They were strictly for amateurs. Professionals weren't really invited to enter the festival. See, the Grand Theatre London was an amateur company, very good though it was. They were not paid professionals, although they had their own theatre.
You were aware of the work of Robert Alban, who had another real name, I understand.
Well, Robert Alban, when I knew him, was called Peter Donkin. He changed his name to Peter Donkin. And he was by that time a television producer in Halifax. And as a matter of fact, the first television part I ever played was with Peter Donkin. Because we left England, I left England, 1951 television hadn't started, there was no television work in England. And it had only just started in Halifax. And we had done a play called The Vigil, which was an Easter play in St. John's. And when we got to Halifax, he said, I want to televise it. And he did it as a television play, and he used the whole company. And it was certainly my first television appearance. Some of the other actors had already appeared in England because I'd been here for 4 years and they were there for the first time. But that's all I know really about Robert Alban.
What he said then was, the move toward professionalism in theatre in Nova Scotia is this is what, who said this?
No, I think these are John's.
He
These are.
grabbed this quote out of the bio file.
Pardon?
He got this quote from the biography file.
Oh.
And this comes, basically what we're getting to is the beginning of the Neptune theatre period.
Well, the beginning of the Neptune, there's no question about it that our success in Halifax must have given somebody, possibly Leon Major, the idea that there is a market for theatre. I mean, there was unquestionably a market for theatre. We did terribly well in Halifax. We never ever stayed there longer than 4 weeks. I think one time we did 5. Because it was a very large auditorium. And it's much easier to sell 4 plays than it is 26. But we found what the likes and the dislikes were. I mean, we were there 5 times, so we probably did a total of 20 to 25 productions there. So I could tell what Halifax liked, what it didn't like, what it might learn to like. There was no question. In fact, Leon Major, when he decided or had got the money to start the Neptune, he called me and he said, now you know the Halifax market. What do they like and what don't they like? I said, well, first of all, they hate farce because they think it's faintly improper. They don't care very much about drama, absolutely adore sophisticated light comedy, and probably would come to see the classics because they think they ought to. That was sort of my summing up. And when he announced his first list of plays, I thought, why did he ever call me? Because it was didn't follow any advice I gave him.
How did the London Theatre Company cease then? You already mentioned the television thing, but the last couple of weeks, when you finally decided we can't go on.
Well, when we finally decided, it was my announcement. At the beginning of the 6th season, we were already being horribly affected by losing audiences to television. It became apparent that this looked as if this would have to be the last season. And in the program notes, I was looking through them the other day, funnily enough, and they're not 40-something years old. And I could see as the weeks went by, I was saying more and more, if you don't come every week, we are going to have to make this the last season. And when I finally announced that this is definitely going to be our last season, that's when the community got together and they had this appreciation for London Theatre Company Week, and that's when they came to me and offered the Canada Council grant. And so we did the 26 weeks, and we just squeezed by that year. I mean, I think we ended up making $800, which of course today is $5,000 or $6,000, even so. All those figures one has to multiply by 7 to arrive at 19 $96.
Theatre New Brunswick. I'd like to delve in the history of the Theatre New Brunswick. Early 60s. Who are some of the names? Can you dab your mouth again?
Yeah.
Take a sip of water, perhaps.
Yeah.
And that. Building. Why did Theatre New Brunswick have to be born? Why did it come into existence? What was the demand, and where was it, and who were the people? The background.
Yeah, okay. There's no question that the London Theatre Company was the reason for Theatre New Brunswick coming into existence. Purely because Theatre New Brunswick was started by Walter Learning, and Walter Learning was a schoolboy usher at the theatre that we played at in St. John's. He saw every play, and before he was old enough to be an usher, he used to sneak out of the classroom and come into the auditorium and watch us rehearse, and he was fascinated with the theatre. And I didn't really know this until I went to Vancouver in 2 or 3 years ago to direct Noises Off for Walter Learning, who was running Vancouver. And he wrote a thing in the program about how he used to sneak in and watch us rehearse. There was this wonderful man who was so kind to somebody who was anxious to learn and talk to him. And then he said, I've now got him here to direct for us this week. It's the first time I really remembered any of this. But he decided he wanted to be in theatre management like us. And somehow or other persuaded somebody, I think it was the Beaverbrooks, wasn't it, in New Brunswick? I think Lady Beaverbrook. Irving, or was it Irving? Yeah, it was somebody with a lot of money. He talked them into starting Theatre New Brunswick, and he really started running it as not a weekly rep company, as a fortnightly. They ran 2. He didn't want to try and put a play on in a week, but he figured he could do it for 2 weeks. And I think they started off by running each play 2 weeks. Then eventually it was 3 weeks.
Then Alexander Gray, do you know?
No, not really.
All right.
Not really.
Brian Swarber?
Well, I know Brian Swarber. I don't really know anything about Brian.
In '63, you co-produced Suddenly Last Summer.
Oh, yes.
For?
Yes.
Yeah. Could you talk about it, this company?
Yes.
Do you remember the name of the company and how the theatre in the Dillon, how you
yes.
using the names of the company? Please.
Right. I think it was in the 1980s, 1983 and 1984. Pat Galloway, who was a great friend of mine, was playing the leads at Stratford. He was a marvelous revue performer. And she got together with Tom Kneebone and Roderick Cook, and they had the idea of putting on a late night revue at the Victorian Inn in Stratford to follow the performance. This is something that's done in towns that have a classical theatre, and has been done very successfully. Gives everybody a little lightness before going home if you've been watching one of the heavy plays. And so they wanted a manager to put this thing together and a producer. So I was not doing anything at the time. Pat was a great friend of mine. So I said I would take this job on. So they wrote this review, which partly was sending up Stratford. They got a lot of the material from upstairs at the downstairs in New York. It was a first-class review. And the trouble was, that year at Stratford, that we decided to start it after the performance at Stratford, they were doing the famous Scottish play, and they were doing Hamlet, uncut, and both versions used to finish at about 12 o'clock at night, by which time we were booked out, sold out at the Victorian Inn, turning people away on the telephone all day. Nobody came. They all got in the car and they drove home. And we were absolutely losing. I mean, it was costing all of us, I don't know how much every week, just to pay the rent on the theatre. And this review had been well reviewed by the Toronto people. So I thought, this review's too good to lose. So I went down to Toronto, and I went to the theatre in the Dell, which used to have at that time one-act plays, which weren't doing very well. And I talked to Willie De Laurentiis, who owned the theatre in the Dell, and I said, "Listen, what you want here is a review, and I've got just a show for you in Stratford. Come up and see it."
The review, you were selling it here to the theatre in the round, and why you should come up and see it.
Oh yeah, yeah. Are we rolling?
Yeah. Yes. Go for it.
So I got Willie De Laurentiis to come to Stratford. I wanted to know when he was coming, and although we were sold out on paper, I knew we wouldn't be by the time he got there. So I went round the town. I got all the bartenders, all the shop girls who weren't working. I filled that place. And the review was terribly funny. And it was an absolute riot that evening. And Willie said, "I've got to have this review. Got to have this." So I made quite a tough deal with him in town. After the Stratford finished, we took it into Toronto. We got rave reviews, and it ran for a year. Sold every night, including Mondays. You could not get a seat. We put on a sequel, actually this autumn. Surprisingly this spring. We did four versions, and we played there for 2 years with enormous success.
Were you fairly new to directing at this point?
Was I directing?
Yeah, you were directing, right?
No.
Acting?
No, I took over in the review. I took over from Roderick Cook in the review. I hadn't really started. This was a long time ago. I hadn't really started directing then. I suppose I've been directing, 20 years, probably now. I used to direct, of course, in the London Theatre Company, because my partner sometimes played, and I would direct him. And when I played the lead, he would direct. So I directed a lot of plays there. But then I became much more interested the last 10, 15 years in directing than I did in acting, quite frankly. To me, it's much more satisfying. For one thing, if you're a director, you can see what's happening. You can see if the play's developing. You can see it improve. If you're an actor, you can't. You may think here that it's improving, but you don't really know. Just because you feel it, and I know you're going to get lots of people who don't agree with me, just because you feel it, it doesn't mean to say they feel it too.
64, you played against Robert Shaw in what was described as a milestone, I think, for Canada.
Canada's very first feature film. It was directed by Budge Crawley, who died the other day, as a matter of fact. And it was called The Luck of Ginger Coffee. And it was played by, it starred Robert Shaw and his wife Mary Ure. And it was about an Irishman who came to Montreal, and and he was a great talker, but he never really got a job, and he was full of blarney. And I was on the very first day shooting of that. I played his bowling buddy. Was it really in 1964? I played his bowling buddy, and I had 2 or 3 scenes with him, and it was middle of winter, freezing cold in Montreal. He had a lovely motorhome, of course, and the Canadian actors, of course, were all in the kitchen somewhere trying to keep warm around somebody's stove. And Robert Shaw said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Go and sit in my motorhome." And he was a terribly, terribly nice guy. And he said to me, which is funny, he said, because everybody was told, you've got to have a North American accent. And when I first came to Toronto to work in television, everybody said, "Can you get rid of that English accent?" So I worked for years. Now I say, this is what you get. But if you don't like it, fine. I'm not going to put on any more phony accents. But it is rounded a bit. But everybody still thinks it's terribly Englishy. So he said, "How did you manage to do that marvelous North American accent?" I said, "Oh, I'm so pleased to hear you say that, because everybody says you're too English." No, he thought that was great. Of course, he ended up playing a lot of American parts himself with an American accent. And he died too, didn't he? Yeah. Very nice guy. And it was quite a successful film. You look at that film now, there's almost every actor you know playing in it somewhere. All well, they're all getting older now, but they were all Canadians except for those two.
And this, of course, was a Canadian book by an immigrant Canadian writer.
That's right. That's right.
Moore,
Yes. Yeah.
Brian or Brian.
Good story.
Yeah. How did you get into that, though? What led to that?
They held auditions. George. Who was the director? Married to Lynn Gorman. Anyway, Lynn Gorman was an actress. She and her husband sort of auditioned people. Sort of got a short list until the director finally. Then we all did auditions because you never get anything, any work on television or film in Canada unless you audition. And I still remember Sean McCann got a Gemini Award. And I remember his speech for this award. He said, "This is the first thing I ever got from the CBC without an audition." Which is perfectly true. It doesn't matter how well you're known. You have to audition for everything. I have never, ever done a film or a television show without having auditioned for it.
Could it be more than formality then?
No, I don't know what it is. I tell you, it's peculiar because I've directed a lot of industrial shows, and which the public doesn't really know about. These shows are very, very expensively staged. They're big musicals put on a stage like the O'Keefe Centre, and with a chorus of 8 girls, an orchestra of 34. And I can remember always used about 6 or 8 well-known singer-dancers, and every year they are auditioned. I had one girl who had played the show for me for the last 4 years, and the client who was sitting, and this is their great moment of glory, sitting in on the auditions, said they wanted to audition Peggy. I said, "But she played in the show last year." "Well, they still wanted to audition." I said, "Well, if you want to audition her, do you mind if I leave the room?" And I went out of the room and came back when they finished. It's quite this sort of thing that they must be auditioned. I don't know. Maybe their voices changed. Maybe they've developed a foreign accent. I don't know why they do it.
Tell me, please, more about this. You did IBM for years.
The IBM shows? I think it started in the middle 60s. I got involved in directing an industrial show, which is, this case it was for BA Oil, which no longer exists. It's now changed its name to Gulf Oil. And these are shows that are staged for representatives of the company, sales representatives or dealers. A lot of money is spent on them. They were always directed by Americans. They didn't think there was anybody in Canada who knew how to direct, because you had to know a bit about music, a bit about design, a bit about lighting, you had to know about actors, you had to know about singers, you had to know about sound, you had to have a little knowledge of a lot of things. These people exist from my day. They don't exist today. This is an era of specialists. I mean, I can remember the time when directors lit their own shows. You never had a lighting designer. They'd never been heard of. And I lit them even though I'm colorblind. And very interesting results I got sometimes too. Gielgud always directed his own shows. But anyway, I did one of these shows and somebody said, "Here's a guy in Canada who knows how to direct industrial shows." Well, I was swamped with work. And it kept me away from acting for, well, probably 10 years, because they were so well paid. I mean, if you did it once, the following year the salary would go up to make sure you would do it again. I've been to Tokyo. I've directed an industrial show for Toyota. I've been to London and directed an industrial show on the stage of the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, believe it or not, which is to me the greatest theatre in England. And there's a long story about that. And then I was approached by IBM to direct. They wanted to liven up their conventions. They spent about $5 million on a convention in those days, and it was a bit stuffy. It was technically beautifully done. I didn't know much about film and slides at that time, but I learned very quickly. And at the end I was producing slideshows and say, that won't do, you've got to put this in here. And I did 30 conventions for them in places as far apart as Jamaica. We always went somewhere warm in the middle of the winter. Nassau, well, the Bahamas we went to half a dozen times. Miami, and of course all across Canada. They were very high pressure, very expensive shows, were very well paid. And when I finally felt I didn't want that kind of pressure, no matter how much homework you did, some big shop would want something changed after you'd finished the final dress rehearsal. And you'd had to go, right, it was all computerized in those days. To make a change was a major thing, and I'd keep people up all night, which I didn't like doing, including myself. So anyway, having made enough money, I didn't do those anymore, which is very lucky because they don't do them either.
In '66, that's the year we got here. I think that's right. That's when you went to the Shaw and joined Barry Morse and his company.
Well, this was when I first came to Toronto in 1957. I didn't work in the theatre for 7 years. I did television. Television was live, which was great fun, much more fun than tape. And there was, of course, a great demand for experienced actors, stage actors particularly, in television, which didn't necessarily work. It's a different medium and has to be approached two different ways. But we all got a lot of work at the beginning. And was it 1964 probably, when Barry ran the theatre? I had a phone call from Barry saying, how would you like to come and play Tarleton in Misalliance and have a big giggle? That's what he said. Barry, a marvellous guy, Barry. And I said, Barry, I haven't been on a stage for a long time. That's a wonderful part, but he's never off the stage. He said, you'll be marvellous in it. So I said, who's going to play the aviatrix? And he said, Zoe Colbo. I said, Zoe Colbo? Oh, I'd love to work with Zoe Colbo. So I agreed to go down there. He didn't pay us very much, Barry. He was like me. He would have made a marvelous actor-manager. I don't think he ever was he? Because he would have watched the pennies, you know. That is every bit as important to him as the artistic side of things. So I went down and Misalliance was the first sellout success that the Shaw Festival ever had. And Zoe Colbo was she is such a marvelous lady. She's Australian. I can remember she used to live in the little motel which had a balcony, and like all the Australians, she'd have her underclothes hanging over the rail drying that she'd just washed in the wash basin. But she was a marvelous actress, though. And I can remember one particular scene where Tarleton has to cry when Zoe says something to him, when the aviatrix says something to him. And one night, she really made me cry, really did cry, which is a no-no to me. And when I came off, I said, oh, Zoe, I'm so sorry. I promise you I'll never, ever do that again. She said, darling, don't apologize. She said, in New York, they apologize if they don't cry. But we had a marvelous season, and Barry is the man who put the Shaw Festival on the map. Oh, Paxton was there for years, but he inherited a going concern, Paxton Whitehead. Barry's the man who put the Shaw Festival. He doesn't really get credit for that, but he is. He's the man who put it there.
Any of the novel ways of publicizing, do you recall?
Well, he was dynamite on the administration and on PR work. I've never known a man like him. he did some extraordinary things. I don't remember them all. I know that he was bothered about the appearance of the theatre, and he got all the little apprentices and the stage management. He gave them paintbrushes and ladders, and they painted the whole of the inside of the theatre for nothing in their own time. He did things like that.
Pause tape, please. It's not something else. Thank you. Right. Barry is an artistic director per se. Competent, would you say, or very good, or what?
He's a good director. He's a good director. As for being a great director, to me there are very, very few of those. And what makes a good director? The first essential of a good director, to me, is to cast properly. If you don't cast properly, you're making life difficult for yourself. And it's extraordinary the number of directors who don't know how to cast. They'll see somebody who looks right, and they think, when I've been directing myself and I've had a producer and we've had people auditioning, and I've had the producer say, well, I think he looks marvellous for the part. And I said, yes, darling, but he can't act. You heard him read, but he can't act. She said, well, how do you know that? I said, if I don't know, after 50 years, who does? I can tell the way they stand there, the way they hold their hands. I would rather somebody audition with his hand in his pocket and stand there and just feel absolutely at ease than somebody who's doing this all the time and that all the time and this all the time and straddling a chair. I'd never hire him. It's phony as hell. Barry's a good director. He was, one of his great things is that he knew where the focus should be, which is the second most important thing that the director should do. He is the audience. He's got to tell the audience where to look at a certain time. And if I want the audience to look, or Barry wanted them to look on the right, you don't want somebody on the left suddenly doing this or cleaning his nails, because you immediately look there and you don't hear that line. So he sets the focus, and Barry was very good at that. And he was quite merciless with people who spoiled the picture or attracted attention at the wrong time. Doesn't mean to say that the actor who isn't in focus at that moment doesn't have to act. He does, but what he has to do is to listen. And a lot of actors today do not know how to listen. Part of the business of acting is listening and looking as if you're understanding, when you're listening, what the person's saying.
Was that difficult to direct people who didn't listen?
Impossible. Impossible. I must say, I only ever had one cast in 50 years that I could not deal with, not to my satisfaction. And that was the last play I directed, and it's why I've never directed another one since. But it was a cast, I regret to say, of very young people, and they don't want to be told anything. I used to say to them, well, what do you want a director for if you want to do it all yourself? Why am I here? Why do you think I'm here? I have the overall view. You just see what you're doing. And it was very difficult to make them understand that, which is very strange, because I've directed students a lot. I've gone to the University of Alberta, directed the graduating class there. I've done the same thing at Ryerson here, and these kids love to be told. These students love to be told. Listen to you avidly. Somehow or other, this cast didn't want to hear what I had to say. And normally I have a cast eating out of my hand. It's the first thing you have to do. If you want them to do what you ask them, you have to have them absolutely trusting you. So you spend the first 2 or 3 days making them totally trust you. You mustn't say anything that they won't believe. Then you can start making them do what you want. Didn't work with this cast for the first time, and I thought, must be me. That's it, don't want to do it anymore. And I've never directed since.
Jumping back to Shaw, there was quite a cast production in terms of fixing up the courthouse.
Yeah, that's the thing I mentioned about just now, was where he got. I don't remember too much about this because I was so busy learning Tarleton, which is a hell of a thing, that I didn't get involved in that. But I knew that people were working day and night, painting the whole place, ceiling as well. All these kids and these students. Barry said it isn't good enough for a theatre. And it wasn't, of course, the courthouse. It's now the seats are all banked. In those days, it was flat.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted you to repeat partly because we had the siren before.
Oh, you want me to repeat part of?
Just the painting bit, actually. Why don't you give me that?
Yes.
What exactly did happen?
While we were doing, this was Barry's one season, of course. We opened with Man and Superman, which is a very long play. And the second production was Miss Alliance, which I played with Zoe. But while I played a tiny part. It was a repertory company in the first production. Obviously, you had to play in everything, and got terrible reviews. I did too. So when we did Miss Alliance a week later, all the critics apologized for giving me a bad review the week before. And but while we were rehearsing Man and Superman, Barry said, this theatre, we were rehearsing in the theatre, this theatre won't do it. It looks awful. He said, the walls are filthy, it's a courthouse, hasn't been painted for years. And he went out and he bought gallons of paint, and he got all the kids and most of the cast. I said, Barry, you're going to have to excuse me because I've got to learn an awful lot of lines. And so I didn't join in it, but everybody, they got together and they painted the courthouse. I remember every inch of it, cleaned all the chairs, screwed them up so they didn't wobble. They put that place and made a theatre of that place.
Could you talk about opening night? Opening night there?
At the very first opening night, I can't really remember.
Let's see. I can remind you. Telegrams, rocket. A rocket. Some kind of rocket.
I don't remember that, you know. No, I think I told John I didn't remember any of that.
Okay, good. We went over this. You should have told me. Nathan Cohen, do you recall him?
Nathan Cohen, to me, I got to know Nathan very well. He was disliked by a lot of the theatrical profession because his reviews were very severe. But I got to know him. He was quite a human being, actually. He really wanted to write the story of the London Theatre Company. He was absolutely entranced by stories, and I used to tell him stories too. I'm writing it myself now, incidentally, and it's nearly finished. But he was dying to write this story, Nathan. So we used to have lunch, and he I used to say to him sometimes, Nathan, why were you so severe about such and such a production? It wasn't bad. He said, I do want the theatre to be good. And it has to be better than it is. And I'm doing this deliberately because I desperately want them to make it better. He said, I'm not trying to be unkind at all. And I believed him, actually. And it wasn't good enough at the beginning. It really wasn't. People were getting away with productions that were not as good as they should have been. Barry changed all that. The standard, he had a marvelous company that year, and the standard was very, very high. He helped put professional theatre on the map in Ontario.
Around that arrival of Barry way back, early 50s, there was a famous phrase, oh, to be in England now that England is here. Have you heard that?
No.
The idea was there were so many British over here in
well, you know,
Toronto.
we weren't, English accents weren't welcome at the beginning in the trial. It's still, I've said many times, I mean, I've got to the point now where if I go for a television audition and they say, can you put on your best Canadian accent? I now say, no, because you won't like it. It'll be false. I'm now old enough that you have to be real on this medium. What you're hearing is what you get. If it isn't what you want, that's fine. And it's ridiculous if somebody writes a story about Toronto that you wouldn't hear any English accents. There are 350,000 people here who live here with English accents. But they worry about the American market. You see, that somebody's going to think it's funny in the United States. Suddenly somebody pops up with an English voice. Don't make any sense, really. Lots of English actors are stars in Hollywood, playing in American films all the time.
Like Liam Neeson and all that. Oh, he's Irish, but definitely an accent. Misalliance comes up with Zoe Caldwell. Why is that of significance in terms of Nathan Cohen?
Well, we've talked about Misalliance.
Talked about Zoe Caldwell.
Yeah.
But why is it vis-a-vis Nathan Cohen, though? Was there a review about that?
Oh, yes. Nathan Cohen, there were no theatre awards in those days, but once a year, Nathan Cohen, he had a radio show, and once a year, he named what he considered the 5 best performances, men or women, that he'd seen during the year. And he named me for Tarleton in Misalliance one year, and I made that list 2 years in a row, because the following year at the Shaw Festival, I played Lord Porteous in the Circle opposite Kate Reid, and Nathan made me one of the 5 for Lord Porteous.
Okay. Please pause tape. Bruno Giussi, what do you know about him?
Bruno was a lovely man. He really was a lovely man. A very, very warm-hearted person. Every came to Toronto, he always dropped in to see me. And I can remember one time when I was in Vancouver, I was playing at the Playhouse, and I've forgotten his name. Isn't that terrible? Huey. I can remember one time I was playing at the Playhouse, and Huey Webster was playing in the University Theatre. We were both in 2 different productions. We both had Sunday off, and no, it wasn't Sunday, it was Monday. We both had Monday off, and we decided we'd go and see Bruno. Huey said, let's go and see Bruno at Gibson's, where they were shooting The Beachcombers.